Hello, students, and welcome back. So, even though you tried to get completely out of a review of your schools of thought, I am doing it anyway. This is mostly just an end of year helpful little video for you. My hope is that as you go forward into college, you might have to take a course very similar to this, and this might actually help. Part one of your schools of thought review is going to cover what I know we covered together. So that'll be gender, it'll be Marxism, and I'll even do New Historicism in it. Part two is going to be the stuff that we didn't quite get to together, and I'm not quite sure how much you got with me out. I apologize to you guys too, because you had a weird school year. You just did. You didn't get the same experience that other kids got, and that was a lot of reasons, However, I hope that you can remember to give the class a little positive review. As you know, next year we did not get 15 kids to register, so they dropped the class. I'm hoping that in the following school year we'll get it back and running again. Do tell your friends that it was actually fun. So anyway, in part one of review, we want to look at feminism or gender studies. You know that I take serious issue with the word feminism. I think the word itself is now too loaded and needs to be revised. And I think fourth wave feminism will focus on that task. I think it's going to inevitably rebrand. We're going to focus on Marxism, and we're going to look at New Historicism, which you've gotten very recently. The last couple videos I've posted have all been centered around New Historicism, so that'll probably be the briefest review. Let's start with gender. So when we looked at gender, the idea was to open it up to looking at the societal factors of gender, but to also correct a lot of common error that I saw with students as they looked at gender and feminism. So your school years have inevitably focused heavily on gender, but often I think in the wrong way. They give you books that are male heavy and they go, look at all these men. It's not really how you're supposed to do things. I do want you to notice when there's an overwhelming lack of one gender, but I don't necessarily have to make you stare at it. I don't want the most profound thing you say about a character to be like, well, they were a woman. All right, good. Nice that you can identify binary gender. But the real part of gender that we wanted to talk about was clarifying where and when different things occurred, and maybe explain to you a little bit about why you have certain feelings about it. We covered historical first wave feminism, second wave feminism, and third wave feminism. We talked about a lot of the ideology of like the angry, man-hating feminist comes out of protest structure in the 60s, which is second wave feminism. And they're not actually, for the most part, man-hating. I mean, I'm sure there are man-hating feminists in the world. They can have it. A lot of us are just not that angry all the time. It takes a lot of energy to be angry. I don't have that energy to give to that kind of anger. I have more what I would call like Ruth Bader Ginsburg level anger, where it's just sort of this slow, tiny bit of simmer somewhere in the back of my brain. I've used RBG a few times, but she comes up most notably in one of my PowerPoints where she was asked what, sort of gender equality would look like on the Supreme Court, and she said, when all the justices are women. And that's not because she believes in some sort of weird matriarchy, it's just that when there were all men for so many years, nobody said anything about it for the longest time. And nobody cares when there's significantly more men than women. So why should we care if there was an all-female Supreme Court or a majority female Supreme Court? It's the thing that when it bothers people when they go, well, I mean, why do you need more women? Why do you care? True gender equality would sort of, it would no longer be a thing that we were commenting on. It would just sort of, well, we're electing the most reasonable person. When you look at gender, we looked at Frankenstein, we looked at Handmaid's Tale. Two books which are normally fan favorites, which you guys for some reason struggled on, especially Handmaid's Tale. A lot of you didn't like it. We were looking at the structure under which many of these things are written. Margaret Atwood, actually very second wave. It's a lot more rigid in the form of, there's an obvious patriarchy in Handmaid's Tale. There's a lot of obvious gender disparity. Women are treated exponentially worse than men. If they want to be treated better, they have to sort of give in to these weird behavioral codes of the society. Whereas Frankenstein is much more subtle, and it's much older, which is what makes it so fun. Mary Shelley herself is a much more sort of, I guess, open feminist figure than the characters in her book. But you have Victor Frankenstein trying to sort of, circumvent natural reproduction by allowing the human body to come back to life after death. So birth without women, life without women. And it blows up in his face in a lot of ways. He also manages to, take the disparate parts of different men and make them into one new man. It's very interesting, the depths by which we saw this. We studied Judith Butler, so you guys understand performativity. That when we look at gender, especially in these older works like Frankenstein, it's interesting to put performance on there. Like, you want to study Victor Frankenstein as this forward, active, sort of classic male hero figure, but in a lot of ways there's things about him that are very feminine, quote unquote. Victor Frankenstein, for all we have a central male character, almost acts like a female character, where a lot of times there's stop action with Victor. He's trying to stop action in the novel, right? Like, he's sitting there dying, telling his story, but it's almost like the story always gets broken up with different things that are his fault. Like, the story gets convoluted because of him. The monster gets abandoned because of him. We have this odd break to the de Lacys because, he abandoned his creature, and there's weird ways in which many of these things are his fault. So it's not the fault of the monster necessarily. We took a little bit of issue, too, with trying to decide whether or not the monster was guilty of crimes. Some of you very vehemently saying yes, others saying no. Gender would have you look to how you're raised. It would have you look to social structure. I would think that feminist scholars would be fairly divided on whether or not the creature is guilty of certain crimes. You could find people on both camps. With Handmaid's Tale, you're certainly looking at a more traditional structure. We also watched Alias Grace, which many of you really liked. And a couple of you watched Wuthering Heights, which is also an interesting piece with this, because Heathcliff and Cathy are sort of very different than your traditional romantic partners in a period book piece. As we move forward to Marxism, which I like to partner around gender, it's much more about power structure in society. So those with and those without. And we use this to talk about, Brave New World. We used it to talk about other science fiction books. A lot of you sort of love-hate relationship with that. Didn't seem to be your favorite. We were also, to be fair, rushing a little bit. You had the ability to watch certain films, notably, of course, District 9. District 9 is usually a fan favorite. The fact that you have this very clear-cut power structure, and it is very reminiscent of sort of traditional politics in South Africa, is very interesting to study Marxism with, because it's modern, and you guys tend to date Marxism in your heads as much older and sort of irrelevant to modern discussion. In looking forward, I would be very interested to see how your studies in gender and in Marxism, and you can consider this for seminar. So these videos are going to drop about an hour before class, and if you were to watch this sort of prior to seminar, you could consider saying things like, how did looking at gender and Marxism in this sort of academic sense maybe influence you during this odd quarantine time? I mean, this is such a unique experience. There's nothing that I could have predicted about your education in the beginning of the year when I was teaching you these things, to the end of the year and what you're living through now. There's deep political and social unrest. There's a lot of things flying about with people trying to either attribute blame, problem solve. Image is very big right now. And I think Marxism in particular is very interesting for you. Who has power, who doesn't, how is it working, what does it really look like? But gender also feeds into this. We also started going into multiculturalism just before I left. I'm going to save some of that discussion for the other video with postcolonialism, because I sort of went between multiculturalism and not, and I think it goes really well with postcolonialism. But to kind of tidbit on multiculturalism, we talked about how society looks at race, particularly looks at culture, the fact that we have sort of been taught standard form discussion pieces on it. I think in the last few weeks you've had a lot to think about with how you understand race, how you understand society, how you want the future to look. In discussion for seminar, I didn't necessarily base some of the specific questions on that, but I had a couple of general questions where if you wanted to talk about schools of thought with this, it's a great opportunity for you to show me anything you learned or any questions you have. We watched The Racial Divide with multiculturalism, and I'll get more to that in the second video, but we already looked at how sort of flipping not just gender, but racial expectations on their head makes us profoundly thoughtful. Thoughtfulness is something you guys should really try to achieve right now. It's easy to be chaotic. It's easy to be angry. It's easy to be dismissive. It's hard to be thoughtful, to really think about things even when what you're thinking about maybe troubles you or upsets you or makes you think about things that you don't really like. Discomfort. Being thoughtful sometimes means making yourself uncomfortable. But it's a good practice. And lastly, New Historicism, which I promised would be a brief video. In terms of New Historicism, looking at context for things, and that can be older works. I usually do it with Shakespeare because I think it really helps to do a New Historicist read with Shakespeare. But you could apply it to modern works. You could totally apply it to Handmaid's Tale. You could totally apply it to Frankenstein, which is significantly newer than Shakespeare, but I still know it's old to you guys. You could even apply it to things like Harry Potter. You could apply it to Twilight. I said this twice now. Who am I? What has quarantine done to me? You could apply New Historicist readings to a lot of different types of literature. Memoir is really good for it. So when you think of memoirs that are coming out, what kind of new Historicist applications you have, you could definitely run through and talk about how they sort of make narrative out of the facts of their own personal backstory. As you guys look forward to the end of the year, I hope that some of these stay with you. And I encourage you, during the last day of class, I'm going to put out a review for the class. It is completely anonymous. I have no idea who says what, but I always read them and I take into account what you say. So please offer me feedback on things you liked, things you would like more of, things you didn't like, or things you thought needed more clarification. This is part 1 of the video, fairly short. Next video will be part 2, and then, sadly, our time in Great Books has come to an end. I'm really going to miss you guys. See you in seminar.